Welcome back. Today we are going to return to some discussion about COVID. We haven't talked about it in a couple of weeks, and but with so much news coming out about the vaccinations, we now have 3 vaccines that are available, and lots of people are going out and getting their vaccine. Richard, I know that you just recently got yours. I'm scheduled to get mine at the end of this coming week, or at least our first round. And so there's a lot of excitement and hope coming out about the vaccines. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today, especially as it relates to, my goodness, so many reports about people who are against the vaccine, despite what's going on.
You and I remember when I started hearing this anti-vaxxer business throughout this pandemic. There's been this misinformation, or however you want to characterize it. I remember in the early days, it was, do we need to worry about it? Is it really real? Do we need to worry about it? Is it just another flu virus? And throughout 2020, we had all these conflicting views about what this was, and should we social distance? Should we remember anti-maskers? Okay, so throughout this pandemic, we've had these differences come up, and now we're at the stage where we do have a vaccine, and now we have instead of anti-maskers, now we have anti-vaxxers. And so we thought, well, that's the latest topic, so let's touch on that. Yes, I got mine last Friday, my first dose last Friday. You're getting yours this coming Friday.
Right.
And all I can say is it's a relief to know that at least we're doing something to try to stave off this pandemic. And so we have 2 articles today about vaccinations and anti-vaxxers. One of them, this first one, is a really nice history about the anti-vax, about vaccines and anti-vaccine.
Yeah, it was actually published before the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
So, but it is a bit of a history, and it dates back. People who are against vaccines date back some time now. I mean, there's a long history.
Yeah, I think you're all we're not going to disclose it yet, but you'll all be surprised with one of the early anti-vaxxers.
Right. But when it comes to things like this, COVID-19 isn't our first pandemic. It's not the first time that we've had widespread viruses or things that can cause death and serious illness. And so that dates back hundreds of years that we at least know about. There were some even before then, but we have good history and good records dating back to the 1300s with the Black Death, right?
Yeah, you've all heard of you studied that in your history classes, the famous Black Death, Black Plague in the 1300s, which absolutely devastated the continent of Europe.
Yeah,
200 million people died, and the population of the world was much smaller then than it is today. Right. And that could be close to half the population of Europe. Eventually, they got herd immunity, but after 200 million people died. So don't wish too hard for herd immunity, because a lot of people are going to die. And by the 1600s, they had that picture of the person with the beak, like the. I always wondered about that.
Yeah.
But what does that mean?
There's old masks.
Right, and it looked like a bird beak.
Yeah.
And the goal was the plague doctors wore those to protect themselves from miasma, the bad air, because by the 1600s they knew there was something in the air causing this thing. So they put on these long beak masks, and then solved that mystery for me. What is that about? But in the 1800s, actually it was in the 1700s, that smallpox was a plague. If you look at the pictures of even some of the founding fathers who got smallpox, and it left sores and lesions, holes in your skin. There's a famous picture of, what did Thomas Jefferson really look like? If somebody got smallpox, they were left with these the scarring and on their faces. But by the 1800s, I guess they refer to it as the third pandemic. So there's 1300s, 1600s, 1800s, was when Alexander Yersin, a French physician, was able to identify the cause of the bubonic plague. And that was it wasn't the rat, it was a flea on the rat.
Right.
That was causing, so finally after 500 years, they finally had the discovery. When you think of ours, it was several months when we discovered the coronavirus, what caused the coronavirus. So science is a good thing.
Yeah.
So then that brings us up to the present day. And what this guy is saying is, here you have this history of plagues. And what he was writing about, and I had almost forgotten about this, was that famous measles epidemic in 2019, and I'd forgotten completely about that.
Right, because people were so upset about those who did not get their kids vaccinated against the measles, and blaming the anti-vaccine movement for this more recent 2019 outbreak of the measles.
Right. Yeah, and as far as the medical community is concerned, you have these, you know about vaccinations, you know what they can do, and it's been the greatest discovery in medicine in hundreds of years that we can actually inoculate, immunize you against the disease. And why on earth wouldn't you do it? Right. And so this measles epidemic in 2019 was another reminder of the value of vaccinations, because measles is a very, very contagious, very virulent. 90% of people who are exposed get it, and 1 or 2 of every 1,000 people who get it will die. So the mortality rate is actually pretty high with measles. It's not a trifling. I had measles. Most of us got it in those years, and it's not lethal for most, but 1 to 2 per thousand is a pretty high mortality rate. And it's a pretty miserable death too. Whooping cough is probably worse. There's a whooping cough vaccine now, and kids who die of whooping cough die a pretty miserable death. So, but with vaccination, the infection rate goes from 90% to 5%. Okay. But in the past 20 years, we've seen a couple of outbreaks, but they're usually confined to very tiny geographic locations, like an Amish community in Ohio and an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in New Jersey. So typically, we know that there are certain religious beliefs that prevent people from becoming vaccinated, but it's usually confined to that single group.
Right. Yeah. And so many times when we see these outbreaks, they are within those who do not do vaccinations, either because of religious reasons or because of health reasons. We certainly have the more recent trigger, I suppose, the most recent reason that many people claim for not vaccinating from recent studies and things like that that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But yeah, we see these outbreaks in very contained situations, or sometimes in other countries, but they're oftentimes in third world countries or countries that don't have access to healthcare for its population. And so, like polio, we have our polio vaccines, but polio isn't completely eradicated. There are people who still get polio, and so it's the vaccine doesn't eradicate these conditions, but it does protect most of us.
Right. And if you vaccinated your country, if everybody in the United States you could reach near eradication. You get very close to. I mean, essentially, polio has been eradicated in the United States, but it's not eradicated worldwide because not everybody has access to polio vaccine.
Right.
And so you don't get complete eradication, but you can get very close, especially if you focus on a particular country.
Right. And then it would just take one of those people from that other country to come to the United States.
That's right.
And then it's here.
That's right. And that's part of the problem now is that as people travel around the world, if you're coming from an area where there are no vaccines and you enter a country like ours where, some groups don't get vaccinated. Well, then they're opportunistic hosts, and so the vaccine settles. It reemerges in people who are unvaccinated. So in the past, most of the anti-vaxxing has been because of religious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But now there is this other reason, and that is that for some reason the vaccines, especially the MMP, the measles, mumps, MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, somehow have been linked to autism,
Right.
and that has become another problem to deal with. In fact, so many people have wanted to avoid the vaccine, were against vaccines, that 17 states now allow for non-medical exemptions.
Right.
We've always allowed for medical exemptions have always existed, but 17 states. It used to be 18, but again, one of the things that I had forgotten about was Disneyland had an outbreak. There was an outbreak of measles in Disneyland. Again, probably because people from other countries came in, had not been vaccinated, and began to spread the disease here. That was in 2015. So California, which was the 18th state that had non-medical exemptions, canceled the non-medical exemptions and said, no, we're going back. So now you have 17 states.
Right.
And then there's a wonderful quote from this article.
Yeah.
It says, but the problem now extends well beyond the insular preferences of some religious groups. In Washington state, the measles epidemic has been attributed to the very aggressive anti-vaccination lobby in the Pacific Northwest. And this is unrelated to religious practices.
Right.
And so there is this movement, this anti-vax movement that somehow took hold and has become so of such concern that the presidents of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the International Pediatric Association called for an international effort to combat dangerous misinformation. And that's their phrase, dangerous misinformation that has made parents fear vaccines. So suddenly this notion that somehow the vaccines are related to autism has frightened parents who are legitimately concerned about the welfare of their children. And as a result, 25%, by 2015, 25% of US children were not vaccinated, or they were only partially vaccinated. And this is a huge health problem.
Absolutely. And a lot of it stems from this, I think we should just call it a myth that that vaccinations cause autism.
Right.
And I know that we will have comments in our on YouTube, on our YouTube channel that says that we are wrong and that it's horrible that we're touting this information, but the research is very consistent that that there is no link between causal link between vaccinations and autism.
Right.
And we've known that just about since the myth began. It was less than a year after that that now famous the Lancet article was published. It was less than a year later, there were multiple articles published that debunked the claims that were made in that article. But as we know, once a myth takes hold, it sticks.
Right. It's very difficult. Once it enters, I was going to say consciousness, but now once it enters the internet,
right,
it's very difficult because it spreads very quickly.
Right.
The myth, and it takes hold. And one of the recurring themes in these articles, and you're right, we don't. There are very strong feelings about vaccinations and vaccines and what they do and what they don't do, and we understand that we're entering a controversial area here, but the issue becomes you can't just criticize people. Criticizing, disparaging, satirizing people who don't immunize their children doesn't work. Trying to scare people into vaccines doesn't work. there's something else at work here. There's some reason why people avoid all of the scientific evidence, the overwhelming, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of studies involving thousands of people. There's an overwhelming science to suggest that they're indicating that there is no link between autism and these vaccines. But once that takes hold, it's very difficult to dispel the myth, because all you have to do is introduce a tiny percentage of doubt.
Right.
You know, you don't have to have overwhelming evidence. You just have to introduce doubt.
Right. And most people don't appreciate the difference between causality and correlation.
That's right.
You know, it just so happens, of course, that at around the same time kids get these vaccines is about the same time that kids begin to show signs and symptoms of autism.
That's right.
That's correlational, because it just so happens that as you get taller, the size of your foot gets bigger, or as you get taller, your weight increases. You know, those things are correlational. It doesn't cause it.
Height doesn't cause weight.
Right. They're correlational. They just tend to happen around the same time, and in the same direction.
Right.
But also, I think that it's important to say that, you know, some of those, what you were just saying, goes both ways. We're not going to, you're not going to, you know, if a person is concerned about vaccines and what the vaccines could do to their kids if they did them, you're not going to shame that person into agreeing to vaccinate their kids.
Right.
And the other direction is true as well. You know, those people who are strongly against vaccines, you're not going to shame people who believe in vaccines into not doing it.
Right.
And you're not going to shame them into believing something that they don't believe.
Right.
So you know, I'll be the first to admit, if there was sound research that came out that showed a link between autism and vaccinations, I would read that research. I would, you know, review it just like I would any other research, and I would incorporate it into my understanding of this relationship. I wouldn't completely deny it just because of what it found, and that's what science is. Science is looking at what the evidence suggests and incorporating it and figuring out, are there certain variables that make it true in some circumstances but make it not true in other circumstances, and that's the scientific process. So we need to, there's a lot of shaming that goes both ways, a lot of insulting that goes both ways, a lot of disparaging comments that go both ways, and that's not going to get us anywhere.
That's right. Yeah, there has to be some reason why. I mean, these are well-intentioned parents. I mean, they want to do the right thing for their children, but they're holding on to this, and you have to call it a misbelief. They're holding on to a misbelief about vaccination, that actually place their children at risk. Okay, and so there has to be some reasonable explanation for why they're doing that. And then we said earlier, we sent out this little teaser about, in 1836, I lost one of my sons, a fine boy of 4 years old. And he goes on to say, I wished I would have given him the inoculation.
This is Ben Franklin.
Yeah, and this is Benjamin Franklin, this is smallpox, and there was an inoculation. We knew that if we took a little bit of smallpox from a cow and injected it into our body, that would protect us from smallpox. So there was an inoculation, there was a vaccine that he could have used, chose not to, and now is expressing, 60 years later, 50 years later, is expressing regret that he didn't allow his son to be vaccinated, because he wouldn't have died of smallpox. And so this isn't new. This notion, and Ben Franklin's a pretty smart guy.
Yeah.
So this notion is not new, that there's this little bit of fear because you're injecting, especially if it's a live virus. Now, the COVID virus is not a live virus. It's a different mechanism. But many are live viruses. Polio is a live virus. Flu vaccine is a live virus. And so there is this innate fear of putting some disease, essentially, in your body.
Right.
But so that's not new. What is new is this link between autism and the vaccines.
Right.
And it began in just 1990,
Right.
when Andrew Wakefield published a couple of papers. Now, this is interesting because what he said in the first two papers is he said measles causes inflammatory bowel disease.
Mm-hmm.
He said there's some link between measles and inflammatory bowel disease. Then he published 8 years later. Now, he's a gastroenterologist.
Right.
And so this is an area of research that he's been involved in. And so you say, okay, there seems to be some link between measles and inflammatory bowel disease. 1998, he published another paper. It was a group of 12 children, and 8 of them whose behavior problems or cognitive problems seemed to appear at about the same time that they were given the measles, mumps, MMR vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
8 of the 12 had bowel inflammation. And
right.
Yet there was no evidence that in those 8 that the measles vaccine caused their inflammatory bowel disease.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But then in 2000, they published another paper linking bowel inflammation to autism spectrum disorder and ADHD and schizophrenia. So you can see how these things started to get linked. We start with measles to inflammatory bowel disease, inflammatory bowel disease to learning and behavior problems, and then inflammatory bowel disease to these disorders. So these are correlational links.
Right.
These things occur at about the same time. They all happen at about the same time. But there's no evidence that one caused the other. We know there's an association, but there's no causal link.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then he did a press conference arguing that we should replace the 3 vaccines and do them one at a time.
Right.
Do a measles vaccine and then mumps and then rubella. When he made that announcement that he's recommending that we have a single vaccine,
mm-hmm.
that's when vaccination rates began to drop in the United States and in Europe.
Right.
However, from then on, from 2000 on, once he did that press conference, and it alarmed the medical community because now you have parents opting not to have their children vaccinated.
Right. Vaccines significantly dropped.
Yeah. Right. Now here's the important part of this. In 2004, The Lancet, the journal where he published the article, retracted a portion of his article. They began to get nervous because other laboratories were trying to replicate Wakefield's results, and they couldn't do it. Nobody could replicate and get these same results.
Right. Nobody could find the same connection that he purported.
Right. And by 2010, the American Journal of Gastroenterology had a full retraction.
Right.
And by 2010, and in that same year, Wakefield lost his license to practice medicine. There were so many flaws and so much misinformation that he actually lost his license. And what we learned later, in 2011, there was an investigative reporter who found that Wakefield had been given 400,000 pounds. That's about $1 million, isn't it?
About 700, probably close to $700,000. Yeah.
Approaching $1 million by a law firm that was looking for clients for a class action lawsuit against the makers of the MMR vaccine. Okay. Now, this is called a major conflict of interest. The other thing was Wakefield had applied for a patent for the single dose vaccine.
Right.
So now you have this significant conflict of interest because not only has he accepted about $250,000 from a law firm looking for this against the MMR vaccine, but he's also applied for a patent for a single dose vaccine. So if you get the single dose vaccine, he stands to make a considerable amount of money.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So between the lack of scientific rigor in his papers and the conflict of interest, he gets stripped of his for unethical behavior.
Right.
Okay? So he gets stripped of his medical license. Okay?
Right.
By 2014, there had been numerous studies, dozens of studies, over and over and over and over and over, dozens of studies that all concluded that vaccines are not associated with autism. And evidence-based meta-analysis, thousands and thousands and thousands of patients came up with the same conclusion, that there is no causal link between vaccines and autism.
Right.
Okay. And so that was the conclusion in 2014.
Right.
However, he still remained popular.
Mm-hmm.
He made the rounds on the circuit. Celebrities made the rounds. There were some celebrities, Jim Carrey and Robert De Niro and Jenny McCarthy and Robert Kennedy Jr., who started appearing on talk shows. And again, it was just enough doubt to keep the myth alive. The scientific community overwhelmingly rejected the connection. And yet the internet and the talk shows and the celebrities were able to introduce enough doubt to keep people from vaccinating their children.
Right. And it's fascinating because, as you said, the scientific community, it's undeniable that the scientific community has demonstrated no link.
Right.
Yet, even within the past 5 or 6 years, half of the population isn't sure if there's a relationship between vaccines and autism, even though there's far more evidence that there's no relationship than there ever was about any kind of relationship. Right. And so this, as you said, this sort of kernel of doubt that was introduced has really influenced a large portion of Americans and people in the world who have now decided to move against vaccines, and for reasons that are not founded, and for reasons that are not in any way supported by medical science. And people will talk about lots of conspiracy theories and all this. Well, that's the government trying to. We're trying to create an explanation to validate these false beliefs, and again, there's just no research to support it at all.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right. Yeah. So about there's this very hard, about 25-30% of people question that. There was one study that said in 2018, 90% of people who were polled said, "Oh yeah, vaccines are effective," but of that group, but still 25% said, "I'm not sure that they're safe." Okay, so we have this persistent, stubborn myth that for some reason vaccines are dangerous. Okay, and so psychologists and other specialists are thinking, why do these myths persist? So that's the second question: is why do these myths persist the way they do? Why would people? Now we know that vaccination works. We know from polio, and we know from all these other childhood diseases, they work, and they're safe, and they're effective. So why on earth would people reject it? And because these are people with good intentions.
Right.
Well, the reason is probably just another conspiracy theory. In other words, you can go back to the assassination of John Kennedy, remember 9/11, where there was all these conspiracy theories, or landing men on the moon. There are still people who believe that that was staged at some studio in Los Angeles, okay, that we never landed on the moon. Although people landed on the moon, there are still people who don't. Flat earthers, the Flat Earth Society, there are still people who say that the earth is flat, okay? So once you introduce doubt, you keep these conspiracies alive. And so the anti-vaxxers are really just another silo of conspiracy theorists, okay, that yeah, there's something wrong here, there's enough doubt. And so what is the what are the common features, okay, of people who of anti-vaxxers, okay? One of them is those who endorse spirituality as a valued basis of knowledge. And we don't, all we're saying is that there are people who believe that spiritual, and I don't mean religious, I mean spiritual, not religious things like some particular kind of religion, but some people who believe that spirituality is a legitimate form of knowledge, and it isn't, because you can't study it.
Not scientific.
Right. The other is there are people who prefer alternative medicine to conventional medicine. I mean, and that's a right. Everybody has that right to have a preference for alternative to conventional medicine. And the other group are those who are unwilling to engage with scientific evidence. Science is hard. Science is difficult. Most of us are not good at it. You and I have had the luxury of being educated as scientists, but most people don't have that luxury. Most kids go to school, they go to high school, they don't really like science, they don't really learn about science, they avoid it in college. Those who study science in college get it, they understand it. Those who don't, and that's the majority of college students don't take hard sciences. And so it's difficult to engage with science and to understand these concepts. And so there are some common features among the anti-vaxxers, but what it leads to is this conspiratorial view that vaccine makers are somehow cooperating with the medical establishment, that you're with big pharma, or you're this, or you're that, the other thing. So there's some conspiracy. Before we leave, the conspiracy was done by Wakefield. That's the irony of this whole thing. The conspiracy was the false evidence, I use quotes, that Wakefield made this connection between vaccines and autism. That was the conspiracy. The conspiracy is not at the other end with pharmacies and the medical community. It was what started with inaccurate information.
Right. And it's, you know, we've talked before on the podcast about confirmatory bias and things like that, where, you know, we have our personal beliefs, and then we tend to only consume information that reinforces, confirms those beliefs, and then we kind of reject other things. And I think that I think one of the fascinating things that you know, it's talked about in this article is the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Right? Had you heard of that before?
I had not heard of it before, but it is absolutely true. You know, the people that tend to be the most confident about their own expertise tend to be the people with the least amount of knowledge about that topic or whatever. So the people who are talking the most and the loudest, typically, about some of these things are generally the people who know the least about these issues.
Yeah, I had not heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but certainly it's true. In our field, there was a controversy years ago about IQ tests.
Right.
And when you had people saying, well, they're this and they're that and the other. But when you talk to people who really know IQ tests, when you get all of the information, suddenly the picture changes dramatically. But the people who know about IQ tests have the softest voices.
Right. Yeah. I don't know how many times I've been in a meeting talking. It's funny that you even mentioned IQ tests, because this happened just this past week. We're in meetings about, and we're trying to explain IQ, and they say, well, you know, IQ predicts this and predicts that. And I was like, no, I don't even know what IQ is.
Right.
All I know is that your score on these tests tend to predict how well you'll do in school. That's about all I know.
That's about it. There's some relationship between measured intellectual ability and school achievement.
Right. That's about it. It doesn't predict success. It doesn't predict Anything else,
Right.
it just is strongly correlated with how well you're going to do and how well you will likely do in school, barring
Right.
some problems. That's all we know. But yeah, you have all these people who are talking about IQ predicts this and it does that, and it doesn't do any of those things.
Right. Right. So a survey of 1,310 US adults found that over a third believed they knew as much or more about the causes of autism than doctors and scientists.
Yeah,
I don't know what to do with that.
it's really troublesome, and it leads to um, it leads to so many problems, primarily for the kids, if we're honest. I've seen in working in the schools, I've seen many times parents pushing and pushing and pushing for a diagnosis of autism when it's not really clear that that's what's going on, but they just want this diagnosis, most likely for a sense of relief that there is a label or an identified reason why their kid has some of these issues.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But instead of really figuring out what's going on, there's this desire just to put a name to it. And so people will look, they'll do internet searches and stuff, and they'll find some of these symptom checklists, and they'll say, oh, well, I can check off 9 of the 12 items there, so
Right.
my kid must have that, or I must have that.
Mm-hmm.
And a symptom checklist is a symptom checklist. Symptoms are symptoms.
It's not a diagnostic test.
It's not a diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No. So, and that's another. So we know that there's some conspiracy theory component here with this anti-vaxxers. There's another thing that's happening, however, with the internet,
Right.
and these are words that are very unfamiliar to me: bots, B-O-T-S, content polluters, and Russian trolls.
Mm-hmm.
They are feeding information into the internet
Mm-hmm.
that either through Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
they are feeding information into the internet that also keeps the myth alive. Okay. Content polluters were 75% more likely to talk about vaccines, and especially anti-vaccines, than non-content polluters. And Russian trolls, and tell me exactly what a troll is. What is a Russian troll?
A troll is just somebody who is it's trolling through the internet, just trolling through and leaving these posts and this information out there anywhere that they find anybody talking about anything related to it, posting these bits of information, usually missing.
Right. So they're sitting at a computer somewhere in another country, presumably, okay, maybe here, and they're just feeding information into this stream. Okay.
Well, and that goes back to the first word you use, bots. A lot of times people will write programs, and the program just does this. The computer does it on its
automatically.
own. Yeah.
It just keeps feeding information
right
to these sites. Okay. So now you have this internet, which is constantly creating and perpetuating all of this information. And the idea is that what the trolls are trying to do is to create misinformation and get people arguing with each other, which is exactly what happened.
Right.
Enough doubt creeps in. So, a few years ago, the president of the United States forms a vaccination study group with Robert Kennedy Jr. at the head of it. Well, Robert Kennedy Jr. is a well-known anti-vaxxer. Okay, so again, nothing came of it except it kept the conspiracy theory alive. Well, I was in Dallas when Kennedy was, and I remember this. It's enough to keep it alive, whether it's the Princess Diana or Robert Kennedy or 9/11, or regardless of what it is, you can keep a myth alive with just a little amount of information.
Right. And that kind of goes to a quote from the second article that was just published, this past week. In that once a myth becomes viral, it's impossible to shake it straight.
Yeah. Right.
And it's absolutely true, because you know, there's, whether it's the confirmation bias or whatever the case may be, there's
Mhm.
just these little seeds that keep getting thrown out there, most of which take no root and have no basis in reality, but they're
Right.
thrown out there, um, and just keeps those questions churning.
That's right. And so the second article, um, which is about the COVID vaccine in
Right.
particular, okay? And so we have this history of anti-vaxxers and where it comes from. It's conspiratorial. Um, and so he begins the article by saying 275 million to one.
Right.
Those are the odds of staying out of the hospital and not dying by getting the COVID-19 vaccine.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And he said, I mean, those are pretty good odds. I would bet on those, right? If I could win the Powerball lottery, if I had a 275 million to one chance, I'd probably put down $20.
Right.
Um, a single individual in Hong Kong died after receiving a vaccine.
And they're not even sure that it was related to the vaccine.
80 million others got it and didn't die.
Right.
Okay. So you're talking about 80 million to one. So you're not going to get the vaccine because 1 out of 80 million died.
And despite those odds, about 33% of Americans say they will not get the vaccine unless they're forced to.
It just is mind boggling. Okay. Why, in the face of overwhelming information, could there be any doubt? Now, we know about Alex Jones. He's churning out misinformation. And we've talked about Andrew Wakefield. Andrew Wakefield is probably a larger problem even than Alex Jones, okay? But the anti-vaxxers preceded Wakefield. I mean, there were anti-vaxxers long before Wakefield. Remember, Benjamin Franklin didn't have his son vaccinated. But these myths persist.
Right.
And I fell victim to the Inuit myth, the myth about, I think we used to say they have 50 words for snow. It wasn't 400. But there's this myth that Inuits have 400 words for snow. They don't. Okay.
Right.
And we knew 50 years ago that the Inuits didn't have 50 words for snow. But yet the myth persists that the Inuits have all these words for snow, and they have 50 words for snow and none for love or something. But that's a myth, okay?
Right.
And it's this author who says that we have to be careful because sometimes two things just happen to coincide in time. And what he tells us is that vaccinations are given between the ages of 1 and 4.
Right.
And autism symptoms appear between the ages of 1 and 4. So you have two things occurring at about the same time. But that coincidence is not evidence. But people have turned coincidence into evidence.
Absolutely. And it's the difference between correlation and causation.
Right.
Just because two things happen at about the same time doesn't mean that one causes the other one.
Right.
That is a massive point that we make when we teach research design, right?
Mm-hmm.
To students, we have to emphasize that correlation and causation are two very, very different things.
Right. Right. And so, regardless of how we studied this question, as late as January 27th, 2021, 75% roughly said they would get a vaccine. 30% won't. 25 to 30% won't. A month later, 70% said yes, which means 30% will not.
Yeah.
So 1 in 3 Americans do not plan to get the vaccine, despite all this evidence. Okay.
Yeah.
So the danger here is, I'm going to wait. I have a little bit of doubt. Other people said Bill Gates wants to inject microchips. The vaccine is going to carry microchips so that he can track us. Other people say, well, let's let herd immunity take it. You have to vaccinate almost everybody in the country to get herd immunity.
Well, and we talked about the problem with herd immunity before.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned it earlier with the Black Plague, that 200 million people died before herd immunity took root. But there's that, and there's all of the arguing and debating and, again, conspiratorial perspectives related to how quickly the vaccines came out and became available.
Right.
You know, because this is the first time, just because this is the first time you've ever heard of a coronavirus, does not mean that this is the first time that there's ever been a coronavirus.
Right.
There are many, many, many coronaviruses. Coronavirus is just named that because of the shape of the cell. It has spikes on it to make it look like a crown, crown. And so, but there's lots of different coronaviruses out there. And so we have some immunizations for some of those. And so it was a matter, for the most part, not to make it too simplified, but for the most part, we could take things that we've already used before and we could tweak it and adjust it to identify a way to make it work for this. So,
the coronavirus was new to us, laymen, but there are scientists who've been studying coronaviruses for 20 years.
Right.
I mean, you get an old bottle of Lysol or some old bottles of bleach, and they'll have, from before 2019,
right.
And they have on their label effective against the coronavirus. Well, we read right through that, didn't mean anything.
Right.
Now it means something, but then what the hell's, what is the coronavirus?
Right.
Because it didn't matter.
And I remember this, there was a post of a posted video of a guy saying, hey, look, this is a Lysol bottle or something like that. And he turns around and says, kills 99% of things. And on it was a coronavirus. He goes, and this is the first time we're ever hearing it. No, this isn't the first time we've ever heard of a coronavirus.
No, there are scientists who are intimately familiar with the coronavirus.
Right.
It's been around for a very long time. I think the common cold is a coronavirus.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, they're very common. SARS and swine flu, all of those were coronaviruses.
They're all coronaviruses. So we didn't, the layman didn't, but the specialists did. And so they already had a leg up. And so it was simple for them. It was a simple matter of just designing an antidote.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, and when we talk about herd immunity, and people will say, well, I'm going to let everybody else get vaccinated because I'll benefit from their vaccinations, okay? However, you're talking about herd immunity. And the problem with herd immunity is that it allows the virus to hang around longer than we want it to, okay? And what a virus will do, because they're so darn smart, they will mutate.
Yeah,
right?
That's what we already
they'll mutate and they'll become something else that is resistant to the vaccines that we're developing. And the mutations are more powerful and more aggressive, and then we don't have anything to treat those, okay? This is what happened in 1918 with the Spanish flu. It was the mutation that caused most of the deaths. It wasn't the original virus. It was when it mutated, and then it became highly, highly virulent and caused a much larger loss of life. And that's what we're trying to avoid now, is let's get everybody vaccinated to stop this thing in its tracks before it has a chance to mutate.
Okay. Yeah. And that's the same thing with, if you think about the flu, you can get the flu vaccine. Well, there's multiple strands of the flu.
Mm-hmm.
So, just because you get the flu vaccine doesn't mean you're not going to get the flu, because there's all of these strands. It's been around for so long, the virus has mutated and adjusted. And so there's different strands of it. And we're going to see the same thing with COVID, COVID-19. So, yeah.
And that's why when Fauci and these other experts, Redfield, Fauci, and the others get on and they say, keep wearing your mask, keep social distancing. That's why, because we want to make sure that this thing doesn't continue to mutate, because it will eventually mutate into something that we don't have a treatment for. And we're going to go right back to 2020. We're going to have another year like we did last year if we don't get this thing under control.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the variants are already appearing. You hear about it in the news. There's a South African variant, this variant, that variant. And one of those variants is going to be immune to the vaccine. So we're going to be starting all over again where we were in March of 2020. That's what scientists are trying to avoid.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we need to be, and there's another point that the articles have made where, a lot of times the things that when we think about herd immunity and taking benefiting from others doing the vaccine but not ourselves, is this idea that, well, even if I got it, it won't be so bad for me.
Right. That's right.
But not really thinking about, all of the other people that could be worse off if they got it. If you're carrying it, or if you do get it and your symptoms aren't that bad, but you give it to someone else. I've talked before about, at my schools, we've had students who tested positive for antibodies, but they had been to school and they had no idea. They were symptom free, but had the antibodies, meaning that they were carrying it, but did not show any symptoms to suggest that they were sick.
Right.
And exposed who knows how many people.
That's right.
So, we need to be thoughtful and proactive for others, not just for ourselves.
Right. And that's right. You don't, there continues to be a vulnerable population out there. And we need to also be mindful that we could be carrying the virus, not know it, and we'd be spreading it to others. So, think this whole thing through. Remember where how anti-vaxxers started, okay, where the conspiracy really is, and where the damage was really done. And this is another one of those conspiracy theories that you need to be very careful about. But we are literally in this life and death situation. Right. So the vaccines are the most important contribution to medicine in 100 years. Absolutely. And so you just can't say, well, I just don't believe it. Right. No, there's a science here that you need to think about.
Right. Absolutely. So, all right. Well, the next time we record, I'll have had my first shot. So I'll let you guys know how that goes.
Yeah, I'll be interested in that. And then you get one a couple weeks later, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm glad you're getting vaccinated. That's good.
Me too. So,
okay.
All right.
You're not an anti-vaxxer.
That's right. Not me. All right. Well, that is it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.